All right. It's just after 30:30, so let's get started. Hello, everyone. My name is Sarah Batty. I am Vice Chair of the British Chamber of Commerce for Luxembourg, and I'm delighted to welcome you all on behalf of the Chamber today. So this is our fourth event of this year's Leadership Forum on the topic of building a sustainable future. And you might have seen, and you might have even been able to join us for some of the other events that we've run already. So we've looked at this topic from various angles. Tax, financial services. We also heard from Mr. Luc Frieden yesterday, who spoke about the Luxembourg Chamber of Commerce's guiding principles for working with businesses on sustainability. And today's discussion is going to be super interesting. So it's brought to you by the British Chamber's legal working group. And they are going to look at how you actually implement ESG key principles in daily business activities and what operational challenges they might face. So I'm super curious to hear about more of that shortly. I'd like to encourage anybody who's got questions on the line to just submit those questions via the Q&A function. It's always great to have a bit of interactivity at the end, so please do keep those questions coming. And I'd also very much like to thank our sponsors. So Alta Domus, Lux States, thank you very much for generously sponsoring this event, and indeed the whole Leadership Forum. And also thank you to our Leadership Forum media partners, Delano. So with that, thank you very much for joining us today. And let's hand over to Cathrine Foldberg-Moller of Simmons & Simmons, who will be moderating today's event. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah, and thank you very much, everyone. I'll start by introducing our speakers and our panelists today. So none of them are actually lawyers, even though this is the legal group, but we thought we would bring to you some operational specialists who really get their hands dirty, so to speak, in this area. So today we have Bradley Davidson, who's an ESG lead at RBS International, followed by Annick Drui, who's a financial analyst and a co-fund manager of BL Sustainable Horizon at Banque de Luxembourg Investments. We also have Nadia Humphreys, who's a business manager working in the sustainable finance solutions with Bloomberg. And finally, we have Michael Maldener, who's a general manager at LuxFlag here in Luxembourg. So we will kick off straight away. And we were curious to hear your thoughts on sustainable finance more generally. And we know that this is something that started popping up all over the place years ago. You could barely go to any conferences without hearing sustainable finance or ESG. And this was long before there was any legislation on the topic as well. And our thoughts were that whether institutions wanted to profile themselves in this sector was to a large extent left to them to decide. And now we see more and more regulation in the field, and it seems to no longer be just a trend. Would you agree with that statement? And do you think the push is coming from investors or policymakers? Nadia, I would be keen to hear your views.
Thank you, Catherine. And I think very much an accurate observation of the evolution of ESG. I would say kind of my first comment here is that it'd be really good if we're able to speak a common language when we talk about environmental, social, or governance points. And what we found historically was that the definition of good or environmentally sustainable varied, and in that variety, false claims might be possible to be made. And the other key point here is where are we aiming and to what end goal? So therefore, how can something be considered environmentally sustainable unless it delivers comparable success relative to those goals? And I think, as you rightly pointed out there, until very recently, being environmentally sustainable meant I'm performing better than my peers. If I'm making product X and I'm doing it with less carbon than my competitor, I am therefore environmentally good. But actually, what we're seeing is regulators are really starting to focus on what it takes to hit their own net zero commitments. And therefore, they need the performance of the underlying industrial corporations, the energy, the transport sector, etc., to align to meet their net zero commitments. And therefore, they need to direct both private capital as well as public capital to finance that transition. And to do that, they have to explain what does good look like. And I think in turn, your question was then, is it asset owners demanding this or is it policymakers? And I would answer that it's sort of both. From a policymaker's perspective, they're attempting to solve these problems of confusion. If I'm being sold a really strong environmental product, is that actually helping achieve some level of goal? And so I think my answer there is yes, policy is definitely driving what we're seeing in terms of the data space, but I think it is with the same end goal of achieving net zero, but also asset owners being able to get clarity and comparison between products.
Thanks, Nadia. That's super interesting, and I'd be interested to hear also what Michael has to say. Working at LuxFlag, I mean, you're at the front line of all of this and labeling and really helping the market categorize these different products. What do you think about the question?
Well, I think actually that first of all, I very much agree with what Nadia said. So that's a starting point. But I think also that aside regulation, we also need to look at the end investor, because at the end, this is where the biggest impact will take place. If we basically can, as a financial industry, convey the message and actually underpin it with proof points, then basically the end investors will buy the products at the end. Then the end investors will also provide us with the capital to drive change even further and help firms also through transition. So I guess it's important not only to look at the regulation, it's important, no doubt about that. It will actually set the scene, so to say, but we also need to keep an eye on the investor side, making sure that we can credibly transfer the message to them so that they understand it also. It's not so much about having at the end very sophisticated language, even though the topic we're talking about is very complex and also requires from time to time very sophisticated knowledge. But we need to keep it simple at the end in order to make sure that the entirety of the society is actually joining us and is willing to join us on this journey towards a better future or the greater good.
And Bradley and Annick, you're more on the consumer side or the customer side of things here, really servicing the market. Do you see a difference compared to sort of 5-10 years ago in terms of investor demand? Bradley, what's your view?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it has changed. So Nadia touched upon that, the fact that the regulators and policymakers are really looking at ESG towards their own ESG or environmental social targets that they have, and they're looking towards the private markets to understand how they can leverage that expertise to get there. But the flip side to that is that we're seeing central banks, so European Central Bank and the Bank of England, making that connection between ESG and financial impact. And I think as they continue to make that link, investors are starting to understand that actually ESG is no longer a niche subsector of this investment portfolio that I have. In fact, I can deliver environmental and social benefits alongside my financial goals. And that's an incredibly empowering thing to have. And so I think as we continue to see that data being built in regards to those specific proof points that Michael referred to, we will see investor demand increase. And we're seeing at the moment investors are scrutinizing ESG strategies to a greater degree than ever before. And I think that'll continue in the long term as investors really look at that connection to understand, actually, is there an opportunity to reduce my ESG risk, meet my financial goals, whilst also delivering environmental and social benefits to society? It's quite a compelling message when you think about the investor and what they can achieve.
And how about you, Annick, at BLI? You have specific products and funds all around ESG. I presume this is in response to your consumer demand, but also your image as an institution.
Yes, absolutely. I think to add maybe to what the other participants have said, it really is so. On one side, we have our own investment strategies where, 3 to 5 years ago, we would decipher this by ourselves. And now, due to regulation, we have more guidelines that we can follow. So this is helpful for us in developing and implementing our investment strategies. But then on the other hand, very clearly, coming from clients and especially our institutional clients, more questions related to sustainability are nowadays included in, requests for proposal and due diligence documents. So we definitely see this push from both sides, even though, I think it's natural to say that this stage is still somewhat of a tick the box exercise. And, but let's say the boxes related to sustainability have definitely grown.
Great, thank you. And whenever we talk about ESG, there seems to be a massive focus on the environmental aspect of it, so the E in ESG. And I was curious, do you think the social and the governance components are getting enough attention? And if not, what do we need to do to change that, or should we change that? Annick?
Yes, so I think, my perspective, managing a fund, and for sure it's no secret that the environment has been at the forefront. And in some regard, I would say this dimension was the easiest to implement in investment strategies, because when we talk about, the environment, straight away we think about renewable energies. So if we as asset managers say, oh, we invest in solar parks or wind farms, hydrogen projects, these are elements that will speak to everyone and that we can clearly and easily explain to our clients. And on the other hand, also, if you say, we are excluding potentially fossil fuels, this is also an element that will be readily understood by everyone in terms of the negative consequences. So, and I do say this loosely, but it was somewhat of the low-hanging fruit, let's say, in terms of investment policies to focus on the environment, and then companies have capitalized on this and have reported on these data the most. But obviously we're seeing the social dimension and the EU focusing on social as well, but it is much, much broader, and it will demand different, I think, competencies and capabilities going forward, but it will inevitably come, I would say.
I'm happy to chime in and help kind of back up the answer to your question, because I completely agree with Annick here, that, initially, yes. Also, one thing, I work for the European Commission's Platform for Sustainable Finance, and maybe one thing to point out is the very first introduction of something like the EU taxonomy only has climate change mitigation and adaptation objectives within it. It's obviously growing to biodiversity, waste management, water and other pollutants, but separately, and we've consulted over the summer on things like the social taxonomy. So how do we appropriately measure social good? And I think that, as Annick has rightly pointed out, is definitely a challenge. In terms of social so far, we typically define it as meeting kind of minimum standards of human and labour rights. And actually, those standards often go beyond law. So they are set by existing frameworks, and you can see this within the EU taxonomy and also within the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation, where they talk about minimum social safeguards and lean upon, UN guiding principles and OECD multinational guidelines. But one thing that I'm very aware of, particularly when we start to look at the data around the S, and perhaps to some extent around the G, is you don't want to drive away investment from high-risk geographies. In actual fact, social matters tend to be very context specific. Child labour is to some extent permitted in certain geographies for certain low-risk labour types. So what do you define as your standards? What do you consistently define as high-risk activities when you want to make sure that there's a certain base standard? How do you drive capital towards achieving that rather than away from geographies who currently perform below that baseline? And so I think these are complex and difficult problems. And I agree with Annick that it's really hard, because in environment, it's reasonably clear, no matter where you operate, that carbon needs to be reduced, and that you need to consider climate risks and adapt to them. Similarly for biodiversity, whilst the data is not there, that you need to improve the way that we're reporting and considering our impact on biodiversity by what we are doing, particularly with regard to infrastructure. That's not so easy in a social context to some extent. A lot of it is you're not directly investing in a company that has anything to do with human trafficking, but could they within their supply chain? Potentially. And are they auditing their supply chain? So I think to unravel that is a harder data problem.
Thank you very much. Apologies, I think my internet connection isn't super stable, so I'm jumping in and out. Michael, could you share your views, please?
I need to unmute. Yeah, thank you. And happy to share my view, because I think what Nadia said is of particular importance, because when we compare the E taxonomy with the upcoming S taxonomy at one point in time, it's a lot about data. But the other big difference is also that we are now actually working towards accepting the measures that are used. The measures for the E side, especially with the climate, we have CO2, for example, as one of the measures we could use. They are becoming accepted. Deriving basically measures being accepted on the social side is probably, it's a journey that we still have to really get started, where we also basically get a baseline acceptance rate, and then only we can talk about getting data off. But interestingly enough, when you look at the SDGs, unless mistaken, about 2/3 of the SDGs are actually linked to certain types of social dimensions. So it basically means that when you see, for example, products, and we see them, for example, also here at LuxFlag, when actually reviewing them or when they're applying for getting being granted a label, that when there's this SDG tilted investment, there's a lot of different approaches in order to achieve the proof of how they basically invest in a sustainable fashion. So basically this alignment that we need to have, and that we will get to on the environmental and especially on the climate side, this is something we have to develop, and this is probably one of the big hurdles the social taxonomy probably will have to overcome in order to be widely accepted, as is in the process for the environmental taxonomy.
Bradley, do you have any additions?
Yeah, so I think the one point that I would just add, I completely agree with what's been said, and especially that data point in regards to how is it that we're going to measure this, and how do we communicate to our customers what good looks like here. I think the social taxonomy, although it's some way away, we'll start to address that, and we've seen the European Commission really look at that kind of first draft. But the interesting bit for social for me is that often when we're looking at social development, it usually falls within policymakers or public funding realm. And so if you're looking at access to quality education or healthcare, these are topics very much rooted in kind of politics and policymakers. And what I don't yet have, and I don't think the market has got to yet, is understanding exactly how private investment works alongside public investment here. With environmental factors, because of the immediacy of the challenge, there has been this great level of collaboration across both markets, but we just haven't seen that on the social side. And so it's difficult to look at areas that would traditionally be publicly financed and say, actually, this is where private investment should be directed, especially if we're looking at the European market. And so that's an added complexity that I think we need to work through to make sure that we're not displacing investment, but actually generating the most positive impact we can. But yeah, that's the one key difference for me.
Thank you very much. Without wanting to go too legal on everyone, Nadia mentioned it earlier, SFDR. I think everyone will have heard of it, the European regulation in terms of disclosure. And we know that that this regulation imposed a lot of obligations on entities in terms of disclosing what they were doing when it comes to ESG, whether it was on their website, their product documentation, their internal investment guidelines, and so on. Annick, from your perspective, how well do you think the market has managed to implement and deal with this?
So, I mean, overall the market I'm not sure on, but let's say in our field, for sure, the transformation is ongoing. And I think, as everyone will agree, it's very complex, and it does touch many different divisions within any firm, really. So yes, we've seen this increase in what we have to produce, and let's say somewhat of a workaround. You've mentioned different types of information that we need to make available and where to make it available. And here, I think the practical challenge was to split it into, let's say, two parts. So we have our legal documents, such as, the prospectus, and here we would give the big picture in terms of sustainability and our approach to it, because they just do take longer to be approved by the regulator, and then to refer back to our websites and specific investment policies where we can give more detail and also just be more flexible in terms of adapting to any new, rules or guidelines that do come in. So
Thanks, Annick. Bradley, what's your view on this?
Yeah, so we're talking to our funds customers an awful lot about SFDR and really seeing hesitancy going for Article 9 just because of the complexities. I think there's an incredible fear of being seen to greenwash, and I completely understand why that fear is there. It only takes a quick search to understand the implications if you are accused of such things. But to me, that means that ultimately the market isn't using this as effectively as it should. And there's a number of things that need to change, but I do think the complexity of completing the submission is one of them. Our customers are really grappling with whether it's worth the risk going for that Article 9, so that dark green as it's referred to. But on the same breath, they see Article 6, so that kind of grey, as potentially making them stand out as a laggard. And so we're seeing a tendency towards Article 8. But ultimately, the aim here is to create a common language across the marketplace that allows for comparability and allows for that assessment to be made. And I don't know any market participants at this stage that would look purely at the designation and take that at its word. There's an awful lot of additional analysis that needs to be done to assess a company's ESG policy. And that's because we just don't have that common framework quite yet for the data itself and the reporting itself. So I think it's absolutely a step in the right direction, and we can't let perfection stand in the way of progress. And so I'm glad to see that we've got these designations coming in, but I don't think that they're as effective as they can be quite yet.
And talking about labels, I mean, we know that there are a lot of different rule sets or taxonomies which are applicable across the different countries. Michael, I think you're probably very well placed to answer this question. Do you think we need a more coherent approach on an international level? I mean, we hear of all these different guidelines. Do investors actually know what they mean? Are they able to compare different products and take an informed investment decision?
That's a very good question, honestly, Cathrine, because that actually touches upon very different angles. First and foremost, obviously, labels are there to help, to guide, and also probably to give an independent view on the certain credentials that an asset manager, for example, or any kind of financial product provider is putting out there. That's in a nutshell what a label should provide. Now the question obviously is this for the time being actually meaningful to everyone? Probably not. And I guess time will actually tell whether we can achieve that. And that's where I think that convergence will be needed, no doubt. But we also need to make sure that we do not lose out of sight what is actually coming from the regulatory side, simply because with all this kind of detailed prescription that we see and actually coming up with level 2 on SFDR, there's likely very little room for kind of differentiation of asset management product providers, for example. When you look at just these templates that we saw that need to go into the prospectus, templates that need to go into the annual reports, I mean, how will you basically differentiate yourself? So you need to do it basically, or you could consider doing it by means of using a particular tilt, being it from the investment side, being it for the distribution, being it geographical, regional, being it whatever. But you basically need to find a way to stick out. And this is also where labels can and hopefully will help in the long term to basically provide this element of credibility. So it's not only basically coming out of the mouth of the asset manager, out of the mouth of the insurance company or the bank or whomever. It's basically actually also looked through and challenged. And that's important to me to be mentioned, challenged by an independent body. For example, LuxFlag can do this in this regard. But it's not only with that that basically will make it or will actually bring us with the challenge. There's also another element, and I actually would like to quote Albert Einstein here, because he said once at a time, if you can't explain it simply, you simply have not understood it well enough. And this is also what we see right now. A lot of sophisticated language is used to sometimes describe processes, to sometimes describe also the way data is being integrated in investment decision processes. This in itself already does not provide for a lot of comfort for investors. It provides rather for confusion. And this is something that, despite the complexity of the regulation and the very detailed prescription that we find in there, we need to make sure that the asset management industry or the financial industry at large finds ways to communicate it in a very simple way. And then also that's where labels can help and will hopefully be able, not only LuxFlag, but also all across, that we can help the industry to guide them towards that goal.
Nadia, you've also been involved in advising on quite an international level, across the globe. How do you see this? Is there different treatment in different countries?
It's a really pertinent question, actually. So I'm very fortunate in that I'm involved in the work of the Green Technical Advisory Group, advising the UK government on shaping a UK taxonomy, and with the Monetary Authority of Singapore looking at a Singapore taxonomy, as well as the work with the EU. So maybe my centre of expertise is more taxonomies than anything else, but I definitely think there is need for global cohesion. And when I try to think that through, what does that mean when advising each of these respective bodies on their own taxonomy? If your objective is climate change mitigation, which is kind of my impact on the environment, so let's start by looking at carbon, and I make a product. Really, the thing I care about is the ton of carbon relative to ton of product. And that doesn't matter where I am. That's what I should be assessed under. Now, with the EU, they've modelled that against the emissions trading system framework. With the UK, they've come out of that and have their own. And with Singapore, they don't have an equivalence to that. But all of them can set thresholds. Now, those thresholds can be relative to kind of the output, so the emissions currently within certain sectors, within their geographies, but it can also be related to trajectory. So how steeply they want to start to decarbonise, or do they want to kind of blend it over time? Now, we've seen the EU come out with an ambition that is, we don't want to leave everything to the tail part of 2050. We want to do a lot before 2030. So they have a very steep initial hockey stick approach, and so their thresholds are very tight. You're not seeing that necessarily within the Asian market. But when we think about common measurement, if all these taxonomies are commonly measuring the same things, then what that leads to is standardized data reporting from companies. Because I think right now, the greatest challenge, both for market participants and for regulators on a global scale, is the lack of mandatory and globally consistent reporting standards. And then I think what that does is it definitely stifles the credibility and comparability of data. Bradley was talking about, do we do Articles 8 or 9, and some of that is a data challenge discussion rather than because it's putting my money in the right space. So with SFDR, there are these things called principal adverse indicators, which are a set of data points. One of those data points would be, does the underlying investee company disclose that they have a human rights policy? Now, if I've been marketing something as an ESG product, and then I tell you, well, I only know whether 20% of my fund have human rights policies, your asset owner is going to be like, what? 80% you didn't even know. Have you asked the question? And I think it's embarrassing, right? It's embarrassing. You're suddenly told, here's a set of, at least 14 mandatory principal adverse indicators. And when I look at some of these investment products, I don't know. I don't know for some of them. And I'm going to reach out to Bloomberg, and I'm going to reach out to other data vendors and say, do you have it? And we're going to say, no, we don't have full coverage for every underlying investee. So you're then going, okay, well, I need to go out and engage these companies, these investee companies, to be able to obtain the data to make that point. Now, that isn't a comfortable place to operate in, but it is a good place to be, because we're starting to encourage a consistent set of data by, yes, admittedly, initially having an asset manager reach out to the underlying investee company to ask for it. That will be painful. It'll be definitely painful for the receiving investee company, with lots of their investors asking for the same data set. But actually, over time, that will lead to people understanding what are the material data points I need to be reporting. And then over time, that will mean access to data. And as long as it's done, again, in a globally consistent way, then you will get a globally consistent data point. And if I might, sorry, just to labour the point, because often you hear data vendors like us talk about, oh, it's incomplete and inconsistent, varies widely across jurisdictions, and it's not good enough as an ESG data. I will tell you right now, you rarely see an ESG report at the same time as the company's financials. There could be up to a 6-month reporting lag. You rarely see an ESG report consistently reported in the same location under the same naming convention at the same place in a company's website. You quite often see a company who might not use the same grouping of subsidiary legal entities in their ESG report as they did the prior year. So you see so much inconsistency in what people are reporting today on ESG that some standardization is going to make it much, much easier for investors to make good investment decisions on those data points. So I think that's really what's needed here.
Sounds like a bit of a maze. Bradley, what do you think? Do you think investors know what they're buying? Do you think they understand? And to loop in a question from Michael from the audience, what criteria should the end customer be looking for in all of this?
That's a wide question to ask. What exactly they should be looking for? So I'll take it in two parts. So in terms of the data points, as Nadia just said, I think one of the most important things about having these frameworks in place is actually that market participants are now able to identify where they don't have the data. And we need to get to a point where entities that are disclosing, look, I have gaps across my supply chain, across my portfolio, but I'm looking to fill them, is a better position than simply not looking. And so absolutely, it's right that we're starting to see where those holes are and that we're starting to fill them so that we can have an efficient market. I'd say it's incredibly important to look at ESG metrics in the context of the entity that you're investing in. I know that's a slightly cop-out answer, but ESG, apart from carbon, which probably is the most universal metric you can use for the environmental side, it will absolutely vary, because what we're not doing is asking funds or investment companies themselves to completely change what they're looking at. All we're asking them to do is use ESG as a new lens to apply to their existing expertise, to the sectors that they really understand, and for them to identify exactly where they can have the greatest impact. It would be wrong to set a standard that doesn't have the flexibility, because ultimately you end up with unintended consequences where you have a certain sector that could be focusing on something incredibly powerful, but in fact has had to focus on something else because simply that's what the framework says. The difficulty with that is that I also don't think we've got efficient demand signals quite at this stage. So I think because investors themselves don't necessarily know where to be looking, they also can't communicate what's most important to them. We don't have enough data for that efficiency to exist between the two counterparties. And so what we're seeing is a general focus on carbon. As we said before, the immediacy requires that, but we don't have a kind of, there's never going to be a single metric that we can look at and ultimately say, yes, that investment is ESG progressive. And so it's really just taking the time, which many don't have or are adverse to applying the time, but to understand exactly where their profile is. So there's many frameworks you can use to look at sectors and say ultimately what's most important, what's material here, and that's the best approach. But unfortunately, we haven't found the kind of single shot that will achieve ESG progression quite yet.
Thanks, Bradley. Annick, we have a question from Sarah from the audience, and she was wondering whether the pandemic, so COVID-19, has been a distraction from all of this ESG and sustainability related matters. Do you think that there's been a shift of attention whilst we've been suffering through COVID-19?
Well, I definitely wouldn't say necessarily distraction as such. If we look at investments, of course, we've had to adapt our ways of working. So maybe in that sense, it was operationally a distraction and something that we had to get used to. But definitely in terms of investments, I think to a question we had earlier, it just accelerated the shift towards the more social dimension, because as Bradley said as well, here we're talking access to healthcare, for example, as well as, treatments and, looking more into this dimension in terms of the pandemic. So distraction, I wouldn't call it that, no. And, the environment is still forefront at this point, but definitely, it's just accelerated the move towards the social dimension.
And on the environment, we see a lot of focus, especially amongst the younger people, Youth for Climate and striking about not protecting the environment. Do you think, Annick, that it is more these retail, more unsophisticated investors who are interested in these green projects? And I appreciate those are not necessarily your client base, but from what you've seen on the market.
So, to call them unsophisticated might be a bit harsh. So what we would say is we have our institutional clients. So these are really the ones that themselves have their own rules in terms of taxonomy to apply. And so they definitely have the bigger knowledge in terms of sustainability. And also I would say, the questions that we get from these clients are very much different compared to retail clients, because what they're looking at is the process. So how are we in practice implementing sustainability into our investment approaches? And it's more about the how as well as, back office and what systems do we use. This is something we don't see in the retail space at all. Here, I would say they are getting pushed via regulations such as MiFID II to have a sustainable profile, and they are being asked questions as well. But what they are looking for in the end, and what might also be driven by these climate marches, as you said, is if I look at your top 10 holdings that you have on your fact sheet, can you please, and here we come back to communication, in simple terms explain to me how these companies fit your sustainable investment strategy and what does set them apart? Why this choice of companies in your fund? So it's a different set of questions, I would say.
Michael, I suspect that you're also faced with those sorts of questions. I mean, you're sort of in between the financial institutions and the market, trying to translate all of this and make it, understandable for the layman and the retail investor. Do you think there is a big demand from retail investors in this sector?
It definitely is. And many different studies have proven that. So it's certainly that the case that institutional investors have led probably by example the last 10, 15 years, maybe, also depending on the geographic origin of the institutional investor. Some areas have probably been a bit earlier than others, but retail is coming more and more. Coming back also to the pandemic, that certainly has caused part of the demand, but also the fact that we have these new generations coming with their wealth and actually wanting to not only get a financial return, but also basically want to make sure that there's also a world worth living in 20, 30, 40, 50 years, where they can then actually still enjoy their wealth that they built over the years. So that's quite natural. The only thing probably that makes me a bit concerned is actually the way SFDR and the fund classification order is actually used. When we think a bit back, SFDR was really used as a kind of self-declaration, right? You basically say, this is the type of product, and this is why I classify it as Article 8 or Article 9. What we, however, see from time to time now, at least in the market, is that these self-classifications, they are used sort of as a label. So there's also distributors and probably also independent financial advisors and people in the market out there. Basically, they don't ask much about the details of an investment strategy. They basically just ask, is it an Article 8? Is it an Article 9? Will it qualify for Article 8 plus or 8.5, thinking MiFID delegated acts? That's pretty much everything they want to know right now. And this is actually, to me at least, an unintended consequence, because regardless of whether it's an Article 8 or an Article 9 or 8.5, I mean, the classification in the first place was done for a reason. And this reason must basically be able, or we must be able to put this reason to test. And this is basically where the asset managers, for example, or the insurance providers or the banks, they need to provide the proof points to say, okay, this is basically why I have done this. And actually, if they cannot deliver the proof points, well, basically, then they probably need to reconsider their classification. But it should not be seen that the classification out of the mouth of the asset manager or insurance provider is basically the holy grail and basically provides a proof, because that's not the case.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you, Michael. Nadia, do you think COVID-19 has had an impact on ESG and how it's been prioritized, so to speak?
I think we saw some really interesting statistics, actually. I think when we conducted a study in the very first year of the pandemic, 9 of the biggest ESG mutual funds in the United States outperformed the S&P 500 index, and 7 of them were beating market benchmarks. And I think to some extent, the reason ESG suddenly had big outperformance is, exclusions of, airlines, oil and gas, etc., that were in the very first year of lockdown, probably not large or maybe equities that were hit harder than those that were in the ESG funds. But it had been something that kind of prior to then, ESG had always tried to demonstrate some extent of alpha and failed. So I think COVID was a little bit helpful to say, actually, these funds do and can outperform. Now that coupled with regulatory pressure that says we understand there is now asset owner demand for ESG, but as the rest of the panelists have said, that there is not greenwashing or mis-selling of those products. How can they rely on not just the Article 8, as Michael pointed out, but the underlying data that supports what strategy that Article 8 has and where their capital is going to, I think is an important place that we come out of COVID with. The other thing, and I think Annick touched upon this, was sustainably linked or kind of COVID linked bonds, that to some extent, when it was a socially linked bond, if it just had COVID in its name in the prospectus, some of the ways that it was classified was as a socially linked product. And I think there needs to be maybe a little bit more scrutiny into those types of financial products that starts to say, where are you aiming and what are you achieving in order for you to carry a label that you are in some way sustainably linked, be that socially or environmentally. And I think it would be very interesting to see, once frameworks like the EU taxonomy have bed down, what the Commission then go on to do in terms of eco-labeling products, leveraging that framework. I think would be kind of the next evolution of those types of tools that we're seeing the legislators start to put forward.
Thanks, Nadia. Bradley, working for an international institution which is present in many countries, what is your approach to ESG? Does it vary?
I think I caught that before you dropped off, so I will talk about how our approach varies. And short, our overall ESG strategy, which I head up for RBS International, the strategy itself and the fundamentals do not vary depending on jurisdiction. There are, of course, nuances that we look at, and depending on our customer segments in each jurisdiction, that will change slightly. But the fundamentals of what we want to do remain the same. Now, if we're looking at this from a regulation perspective, then of course that is going to have to change depending on where we're operating. But I think we have to not let regulation really dictate the strategy of your own business. So we talk to our customers an awful lot about, and I said it before, about ESG being this new lens to look at your existing strategy and apply to your existing expertise. And that's what we're doing too. So we're looking where we as a bank can have the greatest impact, and then we're applying that, and then we're looking to make sure we supply the correct information where we need to for different regulators. What we're not doing is saying this regulator has a particular focus here, and so that's going to completely change what we're doing. I think when we look at this, it's really easy to get lost in the multiple voluntary frameworks, the regulation that's developing, looking across at your peers and saying, well, actually, should I be doing what they're doing? Instead of really just looking at your own business and having that introspective view where you say, actually, how can I challenge us to do better, and how can I embed ESG? And so, of course, it does change jurisdiction to jurisdiction, but only in terms of how we report, rather in terms of the action that we're delivering every day.
Bradley, and thanks for answering the question, even though I didn't manage to finish actually asking it before being cut off.
You're welcome.
Nadia, what's your view on that in terms of the international aspect, and is there a difference from your experience?
From a data vendor's perspective, do you mean, Cathrine? Sorry, just to make sure I'm understanding the question correctly.
just whether there's a difference in approach. I mean, also the different governments that you've been involved in advising and so on, because of course there is a regulatory side to this. So is there a difference in approach? You're talking about Singapore, for example, compared to the UK. Is the focus different? Is the approach different?
Yeah, I mean, that's actually a really interesting question. I think there are common goals, particularly with regard to net zero pledges that the respective governments have made. And I think they want a tooling system that says, can I channel private capital to support the transition? What I often see when I'm talking about any taxonomy is a little bit of a misunderstanding that a company needs to be performing in line with it today. So when you're looking at taxonomies, there's a couple of measurement systems you can use. So one is a revenue-based model. I am operating in a way, let's say I'm a car manufacturer. So right now, cars need to be made that have less than 50 grams of carbon per kilometre travelled, which to most normal people is a zero emission vehicle, like an electric vehicle. There are some plug-in hybrids that might qualify, but the majority wouldn't. And so therefore the revenue I make from selling electric vehicles qualifies under the taxonomy. And so if you invest in me as a car manufacturer, that proportion then goes to the proportion of your product. Now that's great, but those numbers are really small. There are only a small number of companies that are producing revenue from something that is already taxonomy aligned. But when you start to look at capital expenditure, that's when the numbers get really interesting. Because really what you want to do is look at a company that's investing to improve their ability to produce electric vehicles to meet consumer demand, particularly where you see the UK have said, you know, starting from a particular point in time, we no longer want you to manufacture any petrol or diesel vehicles as fresh. And similarly, you've seen in Fit for 55 coming out of the EU, pretty much the death of the combustion engine. And those are really interesting political statements to make, but how do you do that as an investor to aid that transition so that more electric vehicles are on the roads and less emissions through petrol and diesel? So capital expenditure is a really interesting one, because then the creativity, which I think Bradley mentioned well, is, you know, it shouldn't, and I think Annick mentioned this at the start, it shouldn't be a checkbox exercise. I just take my taxonomy report and I produce at the end of the day. It should be, okay, how can I cherry pick the best companies that are investing appropriately to make themselves more taxonomy aligned in the future? And that's your capital expenditure number. So you need to report both turnover and capex. But then similarly, you know, if I'm a bank and I'm lending to a company, is the use of proceeds of my loan going towards something that will align to the taxonomy, i.e., you know, a cement manufacturer who's looking to decarbonize their cement production process and bring them in beneath the EU ETS threshold? Brilliant. Then that loan, even though the cement company isn't operating that way today, but will do at maturity of the loan, would qualify. And so I think sometimes the understanding of forward-looking metrics and using ESG in a forward context is often missed. And that's really the engagement the asset owner needs to have with the asset manager, as how to yield taxonomy alignment over time. And I think for the UK, Singapore, and the EU, that is a common goal.
Thanks, Nadia. And Michael, as we're seeing more and more regulation in this field, what do you think is the biggest challenge for the policymakers?
To be honest, I mean, there are many challenges for them, being it the sequence of regulations and guidelines to be produced and put out. I mean, we see it now with level 2 SFDR being delayed. I mean, I can hardly think of any of the regulatory pieces which actually came out in time where there was no delay or whatsoever. I mean, this is basically where you really see that there's a lot of opinions, and actually trying to find a consensus. That is probably one of the real big issues that policymakers have to deal with. The second thing, and probably also coming back to the point of how to look at it from a kind of a more jurisdiction by jurisdiction point of view. I mean, we see it now that we basically have something on the EU side, and this is basically something that now local regulators need to take into account. That is also where the Commission, unfortunately, has not been very precise in when they were trying to clarify over the summer or address some of the questions that were raised by the industry. Now you see on top national regulators who are trying themselves to find kind of their feet in all this and try to set standards or provide thresholds. A prominent example being actually from Germany, where the German regulator, the BaFin, had issued, or there was a leaked draft at least, of some guidelines earlier this year, where they basically said you need to have 90% in sustainable investments in order to qualify for an Article 9 long term. Now, basically, they have faced the headwind. Now they're down to 75%, which is still, to my opinion, a very, very high number. Whereas compared to others, for example, Spain, if I'm not wrong, they basically still go for 50%. So we basically will have a kind of fragmentation at the end. And the fragmentation will also lead to the fact that asset managers will probably have to tailor products depending on the markets. If you're basically just active in one particular market, fair enough, that's probably something that you can easily do. Maybe two markets also probably fine. But having this kind of differences across the block, but also then obviously going beyond the block and thinking of the UK, thinking about Asia and so on and so forth, that will actually make it for cross-border asset managers quite difficult. And that is probably one of the things that also policymakers should actually bear in mind. How can they themselves also help formulating the requirements, the guidance in such a way that it's not actually having too much of a detrimental impact for asset managers? Because one thing is also clear: if asset managers, insurance providers, and the like cannot actually have a cost-efficient setup to roll out products, then basically this will at the end ultimately detrimentally impact the long-term success of the goals that are set out there.
Thank you, Michael. Annick, just to finish off, do you want to say a few words on that question?
Yes, I think it's easy to agree with what Michael has said, and I think it just comes back to any regulation. It's that balance between being stringent enough, so in this case avoiding any cases of greenwashing or loopholes remaining, and then on the other hand also just providing the flexibility. May that be because of differences across countries or sectors, because we know based on the definitions that the regulation gives, it is not, let's say, just theory. There will be capital and, company strategies will be aligned to these definitions. So that, let's say, the consequences, they are far reaching in terms of where capital will go. So it's really about finding this balance on being stringent enough, as well as, keeping the flexibility. And also, as Michael has said, healthy competition and differentiation between products. So pushing us too much into the same direction may not be the answer either.
Thank you very much, Annick. Conscious of time, and we only have a few minutes left, I'd like to ask each of the panelists to tell us what is the biggest challenge, what has been the biggest challenge in your role so far dealing with all of this ESG. Nadia, do you want to start?
Yeah, I'm happy to. It's a good question. I think for me, it would be balancing the need to move quickly with the need to coordinate globally relevant and applicable solutions, if I'm honest. And in terms of self-reflection, as we've mentioned before, I work with both government authorities and private organisations, and it can be actually really hard when you start to look into the science and you see the damage that has been caused by our way of living to date, and quite frankly, the urgency with which we need to act. And I think when you work in this field, it's fair to say emotions can run pretty high. And therefore building a pragmatic but equally ambitious set of goals and targets that would encourage and reward good investment behaviour, that can definitely be a challenge. The main criticisms we've seen of taxonomy and SFDR, for example, would be availability of data, and ambition levels are outpacing performance of the companies today. And if I'm honest, that is the uncomfortable truth. I mean, we need to be acting and performing at a level that is far, far better than today, and we need to be doing it now. And I think no one really responds well to change at that particular magnitude, pace and scale. But if I'm honest, it needs to happen. And I think these legislative tools are definitely a mirror to us to face reality and start to adjust the way that we work and live and invest. And I think those are really important. So that would be my answer, Cathrine.
Thanks, Nadia. How about you, Annick? What has been your biggest challenge in your ESG role?
Well, I can echo, Nadia, in terms of ambition. I mean, it's for sure it's a difference between having the ambition and the rightful, I'd say, strategy in your own mind to sustainability, but then also being faced with practical challenges in realizing this. So for me, it's really, on one hand, we look at, let's say, larger companies who have an abundance of information to present to us, and it's in contextualizing and really, finding the true best performers. And then on the other hand, when we look at, the smaller niche caps, we're faced with the other extreme where we, in some cases, don't have any data. And that's not to say that these companies do not do their job in terms of sustainability, but it's how am I getting the data out? So it's really combining two data challenges, but different data challenges, and making it fit your ambition in terms of the sustainable product into one is quite a challenge.
Thank you. Michael, would you like to tell us about your biggest challenge?
Well, there are many big challenges, but one probably is the point to make sure that at the end of the day, and that's when I loved back actually when Nadia was saying pragmatism, that we basically apply pragmatism to get started, to move forward ASAP without actually striving necessarily for perfection or go beyond what is actually reasonably achievable, while at the same time striking the balance towards being credible. And that is also important to me, because when you basically try to apply a pragmatic approach, it means that you will also have to you need to accept sometimes also that you will not get everywhere in due course. You basically will make sure that you try to follow sometimes actually the Pareto principle with 80-20, but you still have to explain it. You can say, I know I'm good at this, I'm good at this I'm probably mediocre, and this I cannot actually do right now. That will provide transparency, that will provide credibility, and it will make us move forward. Getting people to understand that, getting people to incorporate that into their daily lives, that's not probably just my biggest challenge, certainly, but that is probably the big challenge we all of us have in this industry, to make sure we move towards the right direction.
Thanks, Michael. And Bradley, just a few words before we hand over to Sarah to round up the session.
Yeah, sure. So similar themes, but I'd say for us, it's making sure we support a just transition. So recognizing that simply walking away from kind of brown activity the way that it stands now isn't necessarily the right thing to do. So making sure we introduce nuance into our strategy so that actually we're supporting customers to transition to a low carbon economy rather than completely focus on those that are green already, because ultimately it won't deliver the solutions that society needs. So I think that's our greatest challenge in terms of finding that nuance.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Nadia, Annick, Michael, and Bradley for joining us today and sharing your thoughts. Sarah, over to you.
Well, thank you so much to all the panelists, and to you indeed, Cathrine, for moderating this event. Absolutely fascinating. I hear we still have lots of work to do. And I really liked one of the quotes, what does good actually look like? And that's one of the things we really need to work on. So a lot of responsibility on everyone's shoulders to get this important topic solved. And thank you so much for raising awareness as part of our leadership forum on that topic. So moving swiftly towards the end, I know we need to wrap up soon. Again, thank you so much to our sponsors, Altadomus, Lux Dates, and Delano, for supporting this event. And if you want to continue the discussions with us, we have one final event tomorrow, which is actually in person at the Luxembourg Chamber of Commerce, where we'll be looking at people, planet, and profit with the People and Leadership Group of the British Chamber. So please, if you haven't registered yet and you'd like to come to our first in-person event actually this year, in fact, since the COVID crisis, I think, you can still register till about 5 o'clock this evening. So please do that. We would love to see you there. Other than that, just to call out a couple of events that are coming up soon. So on the 21st of October, if you're a sustaining member, you can join us and the Ambassador Fleur Thomas for a briefing on various business topics. 18th of November, we have a personal tax lunch event, followed on the 4th of November. No, actually, that's the wrong way around. 4th of November first, a P&L breakfast. 10th of December, Christmas lunch. With its infamous gin bar. So all of these events are up on the website. So if I got a date wrong, please check the right date on the website. Again, thank you very much to everybody who was here today with us. And we look forward to seeing you again very soon. Goodbye, everyone, and have a lovely afternoon.